Here's 10 things I wish I had known before shooting cinematic videos on my Canon camera. Wait. Before we get to the information, please leave a like, subscribe if you like it, if I helped you out. Leave a comment if I'm missing something or if you want me to add something, etc. in a future video. And hit that notification bell because it helps creators like me help creators like you. Thank you very much and I appreciate it, and let's get to it. Number 1, stop shooting auto. Learn how to use manual. Auto anything ruins consistency in the shot by balancing the image for whatever is inside the frame. Your objective is to make the audience forget that they're watching a video. Anything that breaks immersion, like the sudden shift of exposure or white balance, is bound to throw them off. Shot matching white balance is the worst. If you're in a hurry with your white balance, pick anything that's close enough and just try to keep it consistent from shot to shot. Because even if you're wrong by a little bit, at least in post, all your shots match. There's nothing worse than trying to match a bunch of different white balances in your shot. If you don't know what the terms white balance, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO are, I suggest you look at the videos in my description, because I'm not gonna be explaining those things, as I think it would just extend the video for too long, and that's just like the fundamentals. Number 2, learn how and when to preserve your highlights. Nothing says cheap amateur more than clipped highlights without a purpose, or poor visual story representation. If you looked at most films and movies, you'll notice that a lot of them do not have clipped highlights. And when they do, it's with the intention of evoking a particular feeling or mood in mind. The high-end cameras that they use also have the advantage of having much higher dynamic range, which is a measurement of the total amount of brightness values that the camera can capture between pure white and pure black within an image. This means they can retain more detail and have more room for error for when they go and tweak the image back in post. Because we usually don't have the luxury, learning how to retain the maximum amount of dynamic range in our image while setting the mood is very important. The 2 in-camera tools that we're going to use to do this quickly are the histogram and the zebras. The histogram is a graphical representation of the exposure of our image from bright to dark. Any information going beyond either ends is considered clipped, which means it's gone and it will never come back. And a majority of the time, having the information distributed out evenly along the graph will give you the most use out of your dynamic range. And zebras are used to target particular levels of brightness. You can use it to target anything in your scene to know how bright they are. We're going to use both tools together to get you a base image with the most dynamic range. First, go into your menu and set your zebras to 95%. This will let you target the highest brightness levels in your image so you know when you start losing information in your highlights. I also suggest mapping out the zebras to a custom button for easy access. Mine is in the front right here. So when I click, it pulls up. Now that your zebras are on and set to 95, we're first going to start to protect our highlights. First thing you're gonna do is crank up your exposure all the way up until you see the first set of zebras. That's when you know you're clipping. That's when you know you're touching that point where there's no return. Once we reach the point of clip, you're going to slowly dial back your exposure until you no longer see zebras. Now we no longer have any more clipping. This method of exposing your image is called ETTR, which means exposing to the right. For most situations, this is where you'll have your most cinematic looking image because your highlights don't look clipped. But sometimes by this point, you might be wondering, why does my image look darker than it's supposed to be? And that's because different scenes have different levels of contrast. So sometimes you might have a really bright background and a really dark foreground, or the opposite. And the darkness to brightness ratio is uneven. And because we know the situation won't always be perfect is when we move on to rule number 3. But before we get to rule number 3, I want to talk about really bright sources of light, like glass, metallic reflections, sun, ocean reflections, or even bright lights. A tip that's really good for this is just to use your eyes. If your eyes start to burn when you're looking at a source of light, chances are that it just naturally should be blown out in your shot because it's a true representation of what you actually see. Okay, so now rule number 3, learn to shoot log. I'm going to introduce you to 2 more tools to bring those details back. The first one is Canon log. Log is a video profile that allows you to record a flat image with less contrast, stretching out the dynamic range within your image so you can have more creative freedom in post. You can access this setting in your menu. I suggest using Clog3 and its default settings. I think getting used to Clog3 is the best because it's currently the one that's going to give you the most dynamic range in the R series camera. And the second tool you're going to use is Gamma Assist. which will simulate contrast and colors back into your image without recording it in the actual footage. It assists you in seeing what it could potentially look at after you're done with it, and better see the exposure of your image when using log profiles. Now when you apply the ETTR method from before with your zebras, you'll see that you have more details in your shadows than you did with the standard profile. Now that we got to this point and you maxed out the range of your image, it's up to your creative intent as to whether or not you need to bring up the exposure and risk losing detail in your highlights for the sake of your story. You always have the option to bring in more lights to fill in the shadows and balance out your image without losing detail in your highlights. But for the sake of keeping run and gun, I'm not going to talk about that. And then we get to rule number 4, understanding what your base ISO is. Every camera and log profile has an ISO setting that maximizes the quality output of your image. As far as I know, for most Canons on Clog3, that ISO is 800. In theory, what you should do is try to stick to this ISO as much as you can. This means that if you're sitting at ISO 800 and your image is perfectly balanced, you're optimizing to get the most dynamic range and quality out of your sensor. Unfortunately though, in most run and gun scenarios, you never know if you encounter the perfect situation. Especially in cases where it's like too dark and you've already maximized the width of your aperture and your shutter speed and you're forced to go and resort to using your ISO. Sometimes it might be best to leave your base ISO just to balance out the image as best as you can. But really try to stick to your base unless you really have to. Canon also has a steep clipping point in the shadows in Clog3. So underexposing your image too close to the blacks is most likely to leave you with grainy footage. So in tip number 5, I'm going to teach you how to handle the noise with a noise hack. Most of the noise in our footage usually sits in the shadows, especially with log profiles. Even at base ISO, which is the best ISO, if your footage is mostly underexposed, you're bound to see some noise, leaving you with only 2 options to deal with it. You either crush it or denoise it. But the easiest way to actually deal with noise is just to use the ETTR method I mentioned before. By exposing to the right, you're moving your shadows to the mids of your exposure, where most of the information is stored, and leaving your shadows more empty where most of the noise would be stored. But just keep in mind your highlights, because if you're exposing to get rid of the noise in your shadows, you're pushing everything up, which means that you're more likely to get highlights clipped. So keep that in mind. Okay, now tip number 6 is shoot your subject from the shadow side. Shoot from the shadow sides of your subject whenever you get the opportunity. And by this, I mean having the shadow sides of your subject facing the camera, which creates contrast in your image. And contrast creates depth, dimension, and interest. In run and gun situations, you may not always encounter that chance, but just keep that in mind so whenever you see it, you can apply it. Also remember just to use your judgment in regards to its importance to your story and overall image, because you don't want to sacrifice the importance of your story just to shoot from the shadow side. So just make sure that it's convenient and appropriate for the shot. All right, and then lastly, I would say tip number 7 is for night shots. At night, it's very important to let night be night. This means allowing dark areas to look dark rather than trying to make it look like daytime. If you look at most films shot at night, they usually look pretty dark. And that's because it helps the viewer feel like they were actually there, like they're really experiencing the darkness of the scene. So if you have a good light source as your key light, make sure to expose for the highlights and the midtones. And that concludes my 7 tips for Canon users. But really, this could be with any other camera. I just chose Canon because Canon is what I use right now. And I feel like the Canon community could use some support in terms of filmmaking and cinematic content, especially in comparison to some of the other brands, which I shall not mention, who are absolutely killing it on YouTube. But yeah, let me know if you like the tips that I gave you. If you're a beginner and this helped you out, leave a comment. If you think I left anything out that I should have mentioned in the videos, also feel free to let me know. These aren't perfect tips, but I'm telling you, when I was a beginner, this stuff truly, I wish that I knew from day one, but it took a little bit of research. I had to go here, I had to go there. So I felt like, hey, you know what, as a beginner, what would I want to see? This. I wish I had seen this, because maybe it would help me visualize, you know, what I should have known, because it's so much harder to just see people talk and like not really explain things visually. Like, I'm a visual person. So, yeah, feel free to do whatever and whatever. All right. See you later, guys. Thank you very much. And yeah.